Hello, my name is Kevin Dodge, and today I'll be reading Story Time with Matt, Part 10, Grandpa, the Man Who Couldn't Stop Talking. My grandfather was a carpenter up until the ripe old age of 93, and I don't mean the kind of carpentry where he replaced a cabinet door or fixed a leaky faucet. I mean this ancient man would pour concrete foundations, flooring, framing, insulation, sheetrocking, siding, plumbing, electrical, shingles, cabinet installation, lay carpets, oversee and assist renovations, sod laying, high orbit satellite launches. The man could build, repair, demolish, and renovate circles around anyone you know at a third his age. He would give Mom heart attacks constantly with the things he did. When I was 13, my family built a house from the ground up that we later lived in for nearly a decade. Grandpa was our construction foreman. One day we were all working on the roof laying shingles. We had a ladder on the north side of the house and we were carrying supplies up and down on it. At some point we hit a snag with a small patch of bad plywood. Grandpa had an easy fix for it, but he needed the tools from his truck. Now keep in mind that this old codger was still in his early to mid 80s at this point. He decided the ladder was too far away and he scuttled toward the far corner of the roof near the truck at full speed. Mom screamed in a complete panic, "Dad! Dad! Oh Jesus, Dad!" Grandpa tucked, rolled, and grabbed the corner of the roof and just did a little flip off the edge, landing on the ground like a wise old cat. Mom passed out. He was a tough old guy. He brought me on the job once where we were taking down an old second-story balcony. We'd pull off the flooring and I was knocking out support beams. Grandpa didn't like the way I was doing it, and that was frustrating me. He would stand directly beneath me while I was on the ladder and tell me how to correctly hammer the beams loose. I understood he had been around the block 1,000 more times than I had, but I had built an 83-foot tree house a few summers before that and felt I knew my way around a hammer just fine. Well, the beam I was hitting came loose and landed square on his skull. The old man bounced a 7-foot beam off his head, took his blue cloth hat off because hard hats were for wimps, rubbed his head, whistled, then put his hat back on and continued working at a safe distance. I felt bad, but he really shouldn't have been standing there. I didn't realize just how tough he was until we got home 6 hours later and Mom looked at his head. She promptly rushed him to the ER where he got 9 stitches. And then Mom passed out again. Then there was the time a few weeks later when Mom and I were painting one of the bedrooms while Grandpa was installing the water heater. We heard a loud bang and the house flashed blue like somebody had taken a picture. Mom, of course, came unglued at the seams again as she ran through the house throwing paint everywhere. "Oh God! Oh Jesus, Dad! Oh God!" Jesus got shouted at with very non-specific requests quite often at our house, and I'm willing to bet it was wearing thin on old JC by this point. Grandpa stepped out of the utility room into the hallway just before Mom got there and chuckled in his little old man laugh. "Well, I guess that breaker was still on," he said, holding up a plastic-handled screwdriver that had melted in his ungloved hand. Mom and I peeked around their shoulders, and there was about 2 foot wide black blast mark on the wall where he'd shorted the power line. Mom passed out again, of course. This was by far not the first nor the last time he'd sent several thousand volts through himself. There was a theory in our family that that's what kept him going. Every 4 to 5 months, he'd leave a breaker on and jump-start himself like an old car. I watched him do it to himself on another job or two. Zapow! Actually became fairly common occurrence with him. He'd giggle to himself as he blacked out nearly neighborhoods and patted out small fires on his work shirt. He was a lot of fun at Christmas. We never had to plug in a tree. He'd just hold the cord like Uncle Fester. His hair never quite combed down all the way after the water heater, though. At family get-togethers, like Thanksgiving or Easter and such, he'd keep an old cup by his chair filled with old plastic combs. All the grandkids would swarm around him randomly and comb his hair in mass grooming droves while he would monologue through his crossword puzzle. He had thick silver hair by the time I knew him, which, as I already explained, covered the toughest skull since Attila the Hun. So if you suffer from impending baldness, just pass a few 100,000 volts through yourself every few months and you should retain a full, healthy, yet slightly burnt head of hair. He was a man of many catchphrases. Some of the biggest and often repeated hits were, "Boy, when I get old, I'm going to have to slow down." Or, "Well, the weather's going to be chilly today and hot tamale." And his ever-popular job site remark, "Well, I cut the board 3 times and it's still too short." Everyone who ever met him unanimously agreed on one thing about Grandpa, though. It wasn't his nimble cat-like skills, his work ethic, or his toughness that truly defined him. No, the quality that truly set him apart from the rest of humanity was his ability to talk. Dear sweet, shiny, rollerblading baby Jesus with firecrackers, this man could talk more than any 15 people you can name combined. And it's like he wouldn't breathe. He could ramble on for hours. There didn't even need to be anyone else in the room and he would talk. He could talk to the TV, a traffic light, a busy signal, on the telephone, squirrels in his garden. Anyone and anything became his audience, whether with or without consent. Postal workers and garbage collectors had to develop stealthy Green Beret strategies to avoid being tangled in his Mobius loop of conversations. Neighbors and little old church ladies often hid when they heard him coming, and it was seldom useful information. You could listen to him for 2 full solid hours and walk away not knowing more than you did when he started. My favorite was when he would start off on an aimless reply as if he was firing up the second half of a conversation from days ago with someone else. You could be just sitting there reading a book or something and he would just launch off, "Well, no, see what I did was I went up to Home Depot and picked up some of them old 1x4s, that's a 1x4, to split for the molding on Harold's house. And that cashier, she went to the old Spanish church we used to preach at back before they converted that place into offices. But they wouldn't convert them all just because it would have... That gal used to be a waitress at the Catfish Shack where we used to eat, and she said she wanted me to install a toilet for her mama, and I told her I didn't have the supplies for her right then, 'cause I was putting up siding for Carol Lassiter. And do you know they charge by the foot for that stuff? Or at least that's what they told me at the other place. But I got my stuff from the discount store. You know, the discount store off of Gerald's old place. Yeah, well, you wouldn't know him. He died some years back, but hours. He was a sweet old guy who would gladly help anybody in the world, but you simply could not hold a conversation with the man. It was like trying to talk to someone on your favorite television show. Except the TV shows and fast forward and the advertisements come on every 15 seconds. You could never get a word in edgewise, and even if you did, he couldn't hear you. He would just roll over you like a Sherman tank. He'd look at you intently, occasionally, as if he was soaking in every word. Sometimes he'd dip his head to the side in a non-committal way and ask, "Oh?" And you'd think for a moment, "Dear Lord, I finally got him to listen to me." Then he'd rub his permanently all calloused hands together in a dry sound and add this classic gem, "Well, anyway, like I said," and then you knew he had just been pretending to listen. The real kicker was that he was deaf as a post. Before the family all pitched in to buy him hearing aids, he would turn the TV up so loud that the windows in the old house would literally rattle. From outside the house, it sounded like a dubstep rave was happening. You'd walk in expecting strobe lights and 300 teenagers dancing with plastic cups of beer, and instead it's just Grandpa watching Wheel of Fortune. My mom and I lived with him for a little while when I was around 17. I got a good summer job at a place up the road from his house. I got off work one day and I needed a ride home, so I had to call him. This was the phone call that took place. Ring, 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 ring. "Hello, Green's Chicken House." This was his favorite joke. It was funny once, when I was 4. His hearing aid makes that ear-piercing shriek into the phone. "Hey, Grandpa, it's Matt. Can you come pick me up at work?" "Oh, who's this?" Now I'm surrounded by kids and adults on an indoor payphone, and I'm shouting quite loudly, "This is Matt. I'm at work. Can you come pick me up?" "Who?" "Matt. This is Matt, your grandson. Matt, I need a ride home. Oh, Matt? Yeah, it's Matt. Yeah, he's not here. He's at work right now. Click. I physically pulled the phone away from my face and stared at it angrily for like a moment or two. Since Grandpa had trouble holding conversations, a short attention span, and an extreme inability to get to the point, naturally he became a preacher when he was younger. He was known far and wide for his long-winded, nonsensical sermons. When my mom was a kid with what seemed like 48 other siblings, Grandpa had a big problem of preaching way beyond the end of the usual end time for the sermon. My grandmother developed a brilliant plan to get him to be a bit more timely. She told him to put a breath mint in his mouth at the beginning of the sermon and just keep it on his cheek, and when the mint was gone, it was time to wrap up the sermon. This worked really well for a good while until one Sunday when he overshot the end of church by almost 2 hours. When he finally surrendered and dismissed everyone, he realized that instead of grabbing a mint in his pocket, he was sucking on a plastic button the whole time. Thankfully, there was one Sunday night when the family did not have a church service, and Grandpa watched a show that aired every Sunday night at 7 p.m. He loved it. This became his new motivation. At about 6:55, his children, who were piled up in the back pews, would signal by pointing to their watches. For the younger crowd, a watch is an iPhone without internet, games, phone functions, or anything but a time-telling device, which, in ancient times people strapped to their wrists. And no matter where he was in the sermon, he'd close with a fast prayer and hightail it to the parsonage next door to turn the television on. This worked very well until the season was over. Then he went back to his rambling, pointless sermons again. He did have some pretty interesting sermons, though. He was often invited to preach at other churches and sometimes travel out of state and even out of country. He and my grandma actually went on mission trips to Africa 9 separate times. Their usual destinations were Kenya and Tanzania. Their most impressive trip, to me at least, was when they apparently spent several weeks living with the Maasai tribe. They are a beautiful, fierce warrior tribe with red clay in their hair and a knack for spears and the ability to jump really high. Grandma and Grandpa returned home with one of their spears and a cowhide shield once. I always figured it was their way of saying, just take my wallet and go. Thank you for building us more huts. Please stop talking to us and telling us stories. How he got onto a plane with a spear, I'll never understand. I can't even make it on board with toothpaste and water now. Actually, my sister says she thinks the story was that he and my grandma took it apart, as it was made of 3 pieces, and each used a piece as a walking cane. Then the feathery part at the end was claimed as a souvenir. No one realized that under the feather was a dangerously sharp point that could easily end anyone on that plane. But Grandpa wouldn't stop messing with it and actually stabbed himself in the leg while chatting to a stewardess. It was fine. He talked through the pain. It was only a minor flesh wound. I think his favorite traveling was road trips, though. Sometimes he would just randomly knock on my door and ask if I wanted to go to Texas or Missouri or something. Not planning a trip, but just, "Want to come with me to Tennessee?" with the car already running in the driveway. He loved being on the road, especially after Grandma passed away from cancer when I was 15 or so. He was lonely a lot, I think, even with my mom and I living in the house with him. We go on these long, crazy, out-of-the-way trips, and his absolute favorite stop was to go to the Cracker Barrel. We'd be on the road at 4 in the morning, and everyone but him would be a zombie-like state as he talked away the miles. And then suddenly, we would just be at the Cracker Barrel. It was like we woke up there. They would just show up in the middle of nowhere, like Grandpa willed them into existence. "You know what I could use right about now? A Cracker Barrel. Oh, there's one at the next exit." He would have had the waitress pour several pots of coffee directly into his ear so he wouldn't have to stop talking long enough to sip, and then he was good to drive for another 200 miles. One year, he took my cousin Holly and I to Tennessee to visit my aunt's family. On the way there, Holly and I begged, as we did every time we crossed the border into Tennessee, to stop at what was clearly, as advertised, the most amazing tourist trap ever built, Rock City. Rock City was advertised in huge letters on the rooftops of barns. See Rock City. It was advertised on gas station posters. See Rock City. It was on billboards, brochures, dog houses, posted on trees, written on bathroom walls. This place was probably advertised inside ancient tombs buried 3,000 years ago. Thus are written the words of Amun-Ra, see Rock City. I don't know if it was because we asked nicely enough this one time, or if he had just been filled with a particular great batch of Cracker Barrel coffee that morning, or if the moons of Saturn were in retrograde over Venus, or whatever. But Grandpa actually caved, and within a half an hour, Holly and I found ourselves in the parking lot of the legendary Rock City. It was awful, and we loved every second of it. There were giant rocks shaped like random goofy things. Caverns were carved out of these tiny dioramas cut into walls. There were rope bridges, super narrow passageways called the Fat Man's Squeeze. And of course, more gift shops and concession stands than anyone might consider necessary. There was also a large overlook at the top of the cliff. It was a point that many of the advertisements bragged about. A single perch overlooking 7 different states. It was overhyped, overpriced, underwhelming, pun-filled money grab of a park. And it was amazing. We burned up a few rolls of film, ate some bad rock candy, and eventually made our way back to the car. When people say getting there is half the fun, I always think of that trip to Tennessee. Because getting there with Grandpa, even though he rambled the entire time, was a good 80% of the fun of that trip. I suppose over the years we all learned to sort of phase him out when he really started chainsawing through stories. It was sort of a family secret that we had this method of dealing with him. We always brought a sacrifice along. The uninitiated said sacrifice would come away after 4 hours or so and just give you this look like, why didn't you warn me he was going to do that? I have to admit, it was a little satisfying seeing somebody screaming internally as the man broke into his 7th consecutive story about the history of staple guns. My mom's friend thought it would be a neat idea to take him to Indiana with her for a few days to see her family. We tried to warn her that he would talk her ear off, but she thought we were all just being rude and exaggerating. The poor lady had no idea. When they arrived home from the trip, my mom and I and a few others were there to see her face when she stepped out of the car. Grandpa, of course, stepped out of the car in mid-story. Then we told him he wasn't going to be able to put it down, the linoleum, because the old plywood that he bought from that discount store, which was the same store I got that pressboard from, and that's the same place I told him to get the tile from, but he didn't get that one he got. That other, and because it was cheaper, but after we laid it down, it didn't stick right, so we had to go back. She stepped out of the car. Her hair was frazzled, and she had big, sleep-deprived bags under her eyes. She looked like she had been part of some sort of prisoner exchange program, and wherever she had been, they didn't like foreigners. She walked up to my mom, hugged her tight, and said, I had no idea anyone could talk that much. Mom replied, we tried to warn you. Did he ever stop? Oh yes, I figured out a trick eventually that kept him quiet for 2 or 3 hours. We all stopped. Jaws collectively dropped as we gathered in closely. Mom looked like she might cry from the news as such a monumental discovery. Did you say 2 or 3 hours? Oh yes, she said. I took him to Wendy's, got him a triple thick ice cream and put a straw in it for him. Told him it was a milkshake. Took him 3 hours to drink it all. We were all astonished. She continued, yeah, but he would just suck on that straw for a good while until he finally got a little ice cream, and then he would smack his lips and say, boy, that's thick, and go back in for more. Our family bought 38 shares of Wendy's stock that night. The prior record before that, and longtime record holder, was my grandmother at 27 minutes of waking silence. The record closest to that one was 23 seconds, set by a surgeon who attempted to put him under anesthesia once. There was a rumored record of 6 hours involving a desperate Maasai warrior and a tranquilizer dart once, but that one was never confirmed. So Grandma's record held firm. Mom and my sister and I were at Grandma and Grandpa's house once on a calm weeknight. The grandparents were alone in the living room, sitting in their armchairs, working on puzzle books and needlepoint respectively. Grandpa was, of course, rambling at full throttle about the history of corn, or what company made the first toggle bolt or something. He was well into his second hour of ambient storytelling when Grandma snapped, "Hon, would you hush? No one's listening to you!" The whole house fell silent immediately. Grandpa's body wasn't used to silence. Several of us had a theory that he had a weak pressure valve in his body that had to be regulated by constant talking, or he might just explode into a cloud of dense coffee vapors. He quietly did his crossword puzzle, and we listened to the bizarre and unfamiliar sound of a quiet house. Soon enough, he started up again, of course. His first sentence was followed by a large hydraulic-sounding hiss as he built up pressure of not talking for a half-minute vented off. Years after this happened, and a few years after my grandmother passed away, I had a friend over at Grandpa's house. We were in the kitchen, and he was in the living room watching Wheel of Fortune again at the noise level of a medium-sized atomic bomb blast. He was, of course, talking to himself the entire time, even though no one was in the room. I was retelling this exact story about how Grandma shut him up once, and when I loudly imitated her voice and reenacted the "Hon, would you hush?" moment, we heard him suddenly quiet down. I peeked around the corner, and he very cautiously turned the volume on the TV all the way down. He just stared at the TV with wide eyes for a minute or two, and never said a word about what had happened. I think I accidentally haunted my grandpa. Eventually, over the last few years, the electrical began to wear off, and old age finally started to catch up with him. He was a tough old bird, but eventually it was a brief fight with cancer that took him. I vividly remember the last time I saw him. Mom invited the family to come have what might have been the last get-together for a while. Grandpa was still up and about for the most part, so Mom suggested we all go out to eat. Naturally, we went to Cracker Barrel. I ended up sitting beside Grandpa. A bunch of us sat around talking, swapping stories, telling jokes at the table, and somewhere during the middle of it, I noticed he was just sitting there, smiling and listening to all of us. If you didn't know the man, this wouldn't be an extraordinary thing to see, but this was the man who could mumble 68,000-word book in his sleep. He just sat there smiling. He leaned over to tell me something. I took a deep breath and prepared myself for a 3-hour roller coaster ride about Civil War postage stamps, that time he used his boot as a teapot during the war, and the complete inventory of his glove box. He leaned over and just said calmly into my ear, "Do you remember that time I took you and Holly to Rock City?" I replied with a chuckle. "Of course I remember that. That was an awesome day." "Yeah," he smiled. "That sure was fun." And that was it. He just sat back and listened for the rest of the night. It was like he was done. He literally said everything there was to say. The thought of that moment still makes me weep, just a little sometimes. I think about him fairly often. Sometimes I stop by the cemetery and I listen to his grave. I ultimately learned a lot from that talkative old dude. I learned a lot about carpentry. I learned to always check electrical breakers first. I learned that as long as you're respectful, not afraid, and willing to listen as well as talk, strangers can become friends pretty easily. So be outgoing today. Be adventurous and tough. Believe that strangers are mostly good. Be confident in who you are no matter what others say. But please remember to breathe between sentences. Also, whenever you get a chance, see Rock City.